In this section, we're going to talk about considerations for adopting XR into your curriculum. So there are three main considerations for adopting XR into your curriculum. The first of which is, what role will it play in your curriculum? The second is to think about, is this project scalable? And finally, what costs are involved and what funding is required? When we think about the role that it's going to play in the curriculum, start with why. What is the purpose or the goal for using XR? Will it be a replacement of existing teaching techniques, or will it be an adjunct? What technology do you want to use? Do you want to use head-mounted display for VR or for AR? Do you want to use a smartphone or tablet-based AR solution? Now, the answer to this question will often depend on the content availability, right? If you wanted to do specific empathy training, that's most often done in VR settings. Some of the procedural training is best done in VR, but there might be a role for AR, as we saw with Metcognition's PerSim. And then you have to think about, is mobile AR or even just 2D well-created videos sufficient? So even though XR sounds amazing, could you create the same effect using more traditional methods that are improved? And then finally, it's important to think about now what kind of data you will collect. Especially if we're thinking about doing a pilot, we want to show how effective this pilot is. So we need to think about, how can we move beyond user satisfaction data? It's really easy to say that users were happy to use XR or were excited about it because it's a pretty novel technology that not everyone has access to, right? So we know that data is always going to be positive. But thinking about the people that might be funding or making determinations on whether this pilot can officially be part of the curriculum, they want to see more than just student satisfaction or learner satisfaction. They want to see some sort of outcomes. They want to see an intervention. And they want to see some sort of change that happens with performance or attitudes or thinking processes, right? So you have to think about pre and post data with XR serving the role of that intervention. It's also really important to note that simply changing the delivery method from 2D to 3D XR will not make the content better. Make sure that you're leveraging what makes XR unique, and that's that immersive environment. When we think about scalability, we need to think 2 steps ahead. So while we're doing a pilot right now, let's think about what that ideal implementation would look like. How many learners would you need to support? If you're supporting, say, a residency training program for surgery, how many residents do you have total? Are we talking about 5 residents, or are we talking about 30 residents? If you're thinking about including content for medical education, for a class, how many students are in a class? So when you think about putting together a pilot with a single device or 2 devices, you need to think of what it will take to support a class of 200 learners versus 2 learners, right? And this is important because of the logistics. Are these learners going to be learning simultaneously? Are they going to be in small groups? If you had to support 200 learners with, say, 100 devices, where do you keep all these devices? How do you store, transport, prep them for use? And then who's going to support these devices, right? It's very easy early on to think about yourself in this role, but when the project scales up, you have to consider what that means. And so again, while you serve as that faculty champion initially, you really need to plan to scale the project. That scope creep can be very challenging, especially in XR. And what we've seen historically is that people will do a pilot and it's very successful. And so they'll start with 1 device and then they'll get a little bit of funding to then purchase 2 more devices. And now they have 3 devices. And then they'll get a little bit extra funding here and there. Now they're up to 5 or 6 devices, right? And those costs are really just focusing on the hardware, but the faculty time and infrastructure support has not yet scaled, and that creates a problem. So this leads to the final consideration of cost, right? There are going to be significant hidden costs with XR implementations. So think about, some VR units require a device or console, right? So in some of the Oculus Rift, some of the HTC platforms, or even the PlayStation VR requires another device to make it operational. And sometimes that cost is not always considered. Additionally, some of the software uses a subscription model. While Programs like the Organon VR is sort of a one-time license. Other services use a subscription model, which is a yearly cost to continue to use their platform. We also need to think about what support time is required. The faculty XR lead will need protected time in order for this to work. And once you start having larger scale implementations, do you need staff support? And if so, how much time is needed for that staff support? And then finally, where does the funding come from? So ideally, recurrent funding is the way to go, meaning that it's part of a budget, it's part of a recurring grant. Because one-time funding, such as grants or philanthropy, don't often support these recurring costs. So the challenge we often see with individuals that have successful XR pilots is they'll have the hardware cost covered and the first year of software cost. But once that funding goes away, it's on the institution then to adopt the subscription model cost, or the faculty or the individual department to do that, and that funding is not always considered or planned.